abdomen, the part that's going to the abdomen. The overall is T1 to L2. The abdominal preganglionics come from T7 to L2. So it's the lower part of the origin of sympathetic preganglionics. So the cell bodies are in the lower part of where sympathetics come from.
Wait, are we going with L1 or L2?
It's from T7 to L2. Remember, the overall origin is T1 to L2.
So where's T6 going?
T6 is, it's going into thorax.
I thought it was T1 through T.
Well, T1 through L2 are preganglionic cell bodies.
Right, but
Right.
just in the thorax.
But the part that's going to abdominal structures
Yeah.
is T7. Remember, these can go up and down.
T1 and T5 is the thorax. T1 and T6 is thorax. And then after that is
Because it's T1 to T5 or 6. Okay.
Oh, or 6, okay. Okay.
Okay? Okay, so preganglionic axons. They go to paravertebral ganglia along the sympathetic chain. Okay, that's just the same thing that we saw before. The postganglionic cell bodies are in these paravertebral ganglia in the sympathetic chain. Okay. And postganglionic axons go to the body walls through dorsal and ventral rami. So right now we're talking about just the body wall. We're talking about these abdominal muscles that we dissected at the beginning of this section, right? And the deep back muscles that we saw in the first dissection. So body walls, no great shakes, pretty much what you saw in intercostal muscles earlier. So the story on abdominal body wall is pretty much the same you saw in the thoracic body wall. These abdominal muscles are just like intercostal muscles in their sympathetics. The structures in the wall, not necessarily the muscles are not getting visceral motor, but the sweat glands that you got on your belly are the same as the sweat glands that you've got on your chest. And the hairs on the back of your lower back are pretty much treated the same way as the hairs on your upper back. And there's the dermatomes yet again. Okay, visceral motor. Sympathetics to abdominal and pelvic viscera. This is something really different. Okay, so get ready. Okay, preganglionics, no big problem. It's just the lower part, okay, of the spinal cord where sympathetics originate, right? The overall origin of sympathetic preganglionics is T1 to L2. The preganglionics that are going to visceral motor in the abdomen and pelvic viscera, they have to come from somewhere in there, and they come from the lower part. Okay, T5 to L2. That makes sense. The abdomen is lower than the thorax, so it's the lower part of these preganglionic cell bodies.
So what was T7 to L2?
T7 was the abdominal wall, the abdominal wall motor. This is for abdominal viscera. I know there's a lot of just really minor changes and flips and things in there. You'll have to sit down and go over this bit by bit. Okay, the preganglionic axons going to abdominal and also pelvic viscera are in these things that are called splanchnic nerves. We saw those on the back of the thoracic wall, right? They were, yes, Commander.
So when you're talking about the abdominal wall, you're talking about like what we're going to do with quadratus and Warren and stuff, and these are talking about like the ascending
Yeah, abdominal wall, yes, and I was talking about, the rectus abdominis as well, and, the external abdominal oblique and internal oblique and transversus abdominis, all these muscles that are sitting here in the outside wall. Okay? So preganglionics are the lower part of the origin of all your sympathetic preganglionics. Okay, so it's the lower parts. The axons, okay, come out, as we say, as these sympathetic splanchnic nerves. We saw these parts of the greater splanchnic nerve lying on the back of the thoracic wall, remember? T5 through T9, there were these things that were coming out next to the vertebrae and then just heading over towards the midline and coming down. There is another one below that, which picks up where this left off, T10 through 11. There's a lease down there, and then there are some lumbar splanchnics. So these are preganglionics that are coming out, but they're not synapsing along that sympathetic chain. They're going to synapse somewhere else. Okay? Instead of synapsing in these paravertebral ganglia, those little ganglia that we found in the thorax, and they continue all the way down into the sacrum, and remember, all the way up into the cervical region. Okay, that's where we've seen sympathetics, preganglionics have synapsed thus far. For the abdominal viscera, they don't do that. Instead, they pass through, the preganglionics pass through those sympathetic ganglia along the vertebral levels, go down into the back wall of the abdomen, and synapse around those three main branches off the abdominal aorta that you saw, or you saw the branches of in the past two dissections. So where the celiac trunk comes off of the aorta, if you sort of tried to dig down there, there was all this yuck around it. There was sort of this sort of, you know, dental floss and stuff all around there. So all these preganglionics from most of the preganglionics, say from this part of the greater splanchnic, are going to come down and instead of go through the paravertebral ganglia that we saw along each vertebra, go as preganglionics all the way into the abdomen and settle down in front of the abdominal aorta, where they're going to synapse around the celiac trunk. And some of them are going to go down and synapse around the superior mesenteric artery. And then some of them are going to go down and synapse around the inferior mesenteric artery. Okay? So the postganglionics, after having synapse at the origin of these giant arteries that are going out to the abdominal organs, are going to follow the arteries to get to their target. And if you recall, Dr. Wilberg's lecture, he showed you about the development of the gut, you know, and as you know from dissecting open the gut, you open up the gut, and right and left doesn't really mean very much. Things in an embryology were in the midline, some of them had flopped to the right and some of them had flopped to the left. Well, if you innervated these things, you know, with these autonomic motor, you know, you send something off from the right to an organ that looks like it's on the right, and then it flips over and flops over to there. Instead, the parasympathetic preganglionics don't try to follow all this, keep track with all this rotation. Rather, they go to the main arteries and then follow the arteries out to the organ. That way, they don't quite get tied up with each other as something changes from right to left or middle to left and so forth, which is totally different from what we saw in the thorax, or what you'll see when you get into the other parts of the body. Okay, so preganglionics, right, come out in the same places, right, but they don't synapse in these paravertebral vertebrae, ganglia next to the vertebrae. They go down and synapse around a major artery and follow that artery out to the organ that they're going to innervate. So, here's a sympathetic going to an abdominal structure, originates in this intermediate lateral area column, or that we identify as the lateral horn, goes out the ventral ramus, goes down the spinal cord into the ventral root, into the ventral ramus, goes through this paravertebral ganglion, but does not synapse there. The preganglionic continues all the way down until it finds a big blood vessel in front of the abdominal aorta. And when it gets to that vessel around the aorta, it synapses and then follows the blood supply to the organ and goes to the organ that way. Okay, so again, you remember Dr. Wilberg talked about being able to divide the gut tube and the organs associated with the gut tube into a developmental scenario. So right there's the foregut, which you can see is going to be a little, a little stomach here in the first part of the duodenum. Then there's the midgut, which is going to be the rest of the duodenum and the small intestine and part of the, and then there's the hindgut, which is going to be your large intestine and rectum down there. So if we divide these three developmental groups, okay, so this is the small intestine most of the way along the transverse colon, all the way back, and this is stomach and first part duodenum, plus there's a liver up here as well, and gallbladder. So this is stuff innervated, well, it gets its blood from the celiac trunk. This is getting its blood from the superior mesenteric artery. This is getting its blood from the inferior mesenteric. So here are the foregut structures, midgut structures, and hindgut structures. Okay, and these, with a few, are getting they all have a common blood supply. So these are all getting their innervation from some branch of the celiac trunk. These are mainly getting their innervation from the superior mesenteric artery, and these are getting their innervation from the inferior mesenteric artery. Bing, bing, bing. So they match up, the upper part of the abdomen, the middle part of the abdomen, and the lower part of the abdomen. Okay. So here's the picture of these arteries. Why we cut everything out? This is what your cadavers generally look like. So here's our celiac trunk, which is sending blood to liver, gallbladder, stomach, first bit of the duodenum, and then the spleen over here. This is your superior mesenteric, which is going to the lower part of the duodenum and the small intestine and part of the large intestine. This is the inferior mesenteric, which is doing the last part of the large intestine and structures and down into the rectum. You can notice in this picture, which isn't obvious when you're from your dissection, that in fact the superior mesenteric is remarkably near the celiac trunk. It seems like it's lower down when you're dissecting all the mesenteries down here, but in fact they're right next to each other. And these ganglia, where the sympathetics to the abdominal and pelvic viscera are synapsing, are surrounding these arteries. And so here's a big ganglia, a big celiac ganglia, and a superior mesenteric ganglia. And in fact, they blur together. They're not terribly discrete. You can't really dissect them out. But again, when you look at your cadavers now and you look around that, you'll see all sorts of stringy stuff. Because around each of these, there are plexuses. So this is called the intermesenteric, the sort of a ganglion sort of hanging out in the middle there, and then there's one around the inferior mesenteric and a few bits and pieces down here, and then there's another ganglia down here in the pelvis that we don't have to deal with. Okay. So, visceral motor, the sympathetics, this is how the sympathetics get to abdominal and pelvic viscera. Another diagram, supposed to look a little bit more like the real thing. So here are these splanchnics coming down, and then around this celiac trunk, there are these sort of blobs of ganglia, and then around the superior mesenteric and around the inferior mesenteric. So there are ganglia all the way there, where the preganglionids are going to synapse, postganglionids are going to follow these arterial branches out to how they get to the organs. Okay? Once again, dividing it up by these splanchnic nerves. The only one you've seen is the greater splanchnic, because the others are behind the diaphragm. But here's our greater splanchnic. We saw part of that, right? Contributions from T5, C6, T7, T8, and T9. They come together to form the greater splanchnic nerve, which dives into this ganglion around the celiac trunk, and then there's more ganglia down here around the superior mesenteric artery. And then the lesser and least, other splanchnic nerves that are again going into these ganglia surrounding these major arteries coming off the abdominal aorta. Okay, so there is a rule, okay? The preganglionics going to the foregut organs, that is following the celiac trunk to get to the organs, come from 5 levels, T5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The splanchnics going to midgut organs come from overlap here, T9, T10, T11, and T12. They go to the superior mesenteric ganglia, and then the ones going to the inferior mesenteric ganglia around the inferior, go out with the inferior mesenteric artery, come from 3 levels, T12, L1, and L2, right? So these are all places where you have sympathetic preganglionics, but obviously they're not discrete. The superior mesenteric artery gets some stuff from T9, as does the ganglion around the celiac trunk. And likewise, the inferior mesenteric artery, its ganglia pick up preganglionics from an overlap with part that's going to the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, so the result of this is that structures that are getting their blood supply from celiac trunk or superior mesenteric or inferior mesenteric get their preganglionic sympathetics from different levels. Obviously, there is some disagreement. Different books will tell you that the preganglionics come from one level or the other. Here are 2 books that we've suggested you might want to look at. Obviously, Stern argues that the upper part of the stomach is limited to preganglionics from T5 and 6. Moore suggests maybe 6 to 9, and it probably actually varies from person to person. And I don't know how many people have actually bothered to try to trace these things down, but you get the general picture. Celiac trunk stuff's coming from the upper part,